Chapter 3, Aloha Summer. Chapter 3. Well, there were 3 things I knew. First, I knew to stay away from girls, and I knew that if I ever got to dry land, I'd never get near the ocean again. But to be right honest, I was beginning to have my doubts about the 3rd thing I knew, about God. That's because it took us so long to get the boat stopped. Compared to the harbor in Honolulu, the one where we landed next was absolutely tiny. There were no buildings at all, just a big wooden dock that connected to another narrow dock. The whole thing wasn't much bigger than the cow lot back on our farm. Christopher Sanchez was the captain of Mr. Dole's schooner. He was from Portugal. Captain Sanchez shouted at the first mate, a short man with brown skin and almond-shaped eyes called Ching Lung. They slid the schooner right up alongside the wooden dock, as smooth as a hot knife slicing through fresh butter. Once the schooner was secured, Captain Sanchez and Ching Lung lowered a wooden plank. I was the first one off. Like the dock at Honolulu, the stink of creosote clung to the wood. I walked to the end of the dock and jumped to the ground. I didn't stand there long because the waves lapped up and got my shoes wet. A steep rocky hill stretched out in front of me. I had to walk quite a ways to find anything but bare rock. There was no grass or nothing. Finally, I found a clump of trees and sat down in the shade. I didn't bother to look back. I was so sick I didn't even want to look in the direction of the water. I figured if I sat really still and stared at the ground and the trees, maybe my eyes would quit rolling. The trees near where I sat looked a lot like the mesquite trees down by Wichita Falls in Texas. There was cactus everywhere, too. The ground was red, just like the soil back home, only full of little rocks. Man alive, I thought. If this is an island paradise, I'd sure hate to see that place the preachers are always threatening us with in church. Hawaii was supposed to be palm trees swaying in the breeze and white sandy beaches and pretty girls running around in grass skirts or something. Lanai looked more like Oklahoma. It was hot and dry. There were mesquite trees and red dirt, and suddenly a movement caught my eye. I froze. Not even letting my eyes blink, I held my breath and watched. A big tom turkey strutted from behind a pile of brush. He was a wild turkey, dark-feathered, and sporting a fine beard. Behind him, 2 hens appeared. They paused to peck at the ground, then scurried along to hide in another pile of brush. All at once, the tom's head shot straight up in the air. He spun and raced across a little opening. The hens followed, running away before they spread their big dark wings and took flight. I hadn't moved a bit, so I glanced around to see what had spooked them. A horse stood not 10 feet behind me. She was a sorrel with 1 white stocking. She was short and looked more like a Welsh pony than a horse. The horse pawed the ground and gave a loud snort when I leaned around the tree. When the girl on the mare's back saw me, she gave a little jerk. Then she smiled, and deep dimples broke the smooth line of her golden brown cheek. Hi, I said back. She nodded toward the schooner. You're Makua, the new Ali? Frowning, I tilted my head to the side. Huh? Your father, she said. Is he the new Ali? With a grunt, I struggled to my feet and took a step toward her. I was still wobbly and weak from being so seasick. What did you say? She put a hand to her mouth. I could see a flush across her bronzed face. I'm sorry, she laughed. I've spent too much time with my grandfather. He does not speak English too good. Makua means father, and Ali is the word for chief or boss. I asked if your father was the new boss. So real quick, Ali is spelled A-L-I-I. So you might have to check on pronunciation on that. I'm not really sure. But for now, I will say Ali. I shook my head and took another step closer. No, he's just going to be working for Mr. Dole on his plantation, not a boss or a foreman or anything. The smile left her face. Even without the warm grin, she was still kind of pretty. Her long black hair was straight and came down below her shoulders. She had a crisp white blouse and a blue cotton skirt. The horse stomped her foot when I walked closer. My name's John Priddle. I'm from Oklahoma. She didn't say anything. For some strange reason, I felt kind of awkward. You from around here? The instant I asked, I felt my eyes roll inside my head. Boy, what a dumb thing to say. The girl nodded. Yes, I live with my grandfather, Mackay, she said, pointing. What's his name? Mac? Mac-I? Is I your last name? She sighed and shook her head. No, Mackay means toward the sea. She nodded at a small ridge. We live by the ocean, beyond that little hill. My father's name is Mackay Pukui. She smiled at me. I couldn't help smiling back. I wanted to talk to her, but for the life of me, I couldn't think of anything to say. For some strange reason, I felt kind of nervous and twittery inside. I looked down at the red dirt and sort of shifted from one foot to the other before I looked up at her again. That's a mighty fine-looking animal you're riding. You talk about out of the frying pan into the fire. I'm going to go ahead and read chapter 4 also because that was pretty short. So moving on to chapter 4. All I said was, that's a mighty fine-looking animal you're riding. I tried to explain when Daddy asked me why I had a horse. That's all? Yes, sir, that's all. First thing I know, she hopped down and handed me the reins. I was petting the mare and trying to figure out something else to say to the girl. When I looked up, she was gone. Gone? Daddy cocked an eyebrow. Gone, I repeated. The mare pawed the ground and tossed her head. I mean, like 1 minute she was there and the next minute it was just me and this horse. I don't know what happened. I don't know what happened either, Daddy said, frowning, but you got to find her and give it back. Captain Sanchez stepped up beside us. I guess he'd heard part of what was going on. Pretty girl, about your age, maybe a little younger? Yes, sir. Long black hair and all dressed for school? Black hair about down to here, I reached around and marked across my back with my hand. With a smile, Captain Sanchez nodded. Sounds like Carol Pukui. She and her grandfather live over on Hulapo Bay. Old man's a fisherman. I offered the reins to him. You know where she lives, could you? Rough, calloused hands closed over mine, wrapping my grip about the reins. To return the gift? To give the horse back? It would be not a good thing. I frowned and tilted my head to the side. Captain Sanchez's smile was gentle and patient. Makali Pukui is an old man. He has raised his granddaughter in the old ways, the old Hawaiian traditions. You admired something that belonged to her, so she gave it to you. The Hawaiians are a very generous and giving people, Captain Sanchez explained, especially the ones who live on the outer islands and haven't been, jaded by big city life, like some in Honolulu. Huh? Daddy and I both asked at the same time. The captain let go of my hands and put an arm on my shoulder. Granted, a horse is a little much. Usually a gift would be a flower lei or some handmade item. Nonetheless, generosity is a matter of pride to these people. But, I stammered. We can't keep her horse, Daddy said. It wouldn't be right. Captain Sanchez shrugged. The decision is yours, but to return the horse would be an insult. It would hurt the old man's feelings as well as bring shame to his granddaughter. Now, George Munro has a couple of horses not far from his house. You could keep it there and... Captain Sanchez? Daddy interrupted. It just doesn't seem right to... Keith, Mama broke in. I guess she'd been standing behind us for a while. We didn't notice her until she stepped between Daddy and me to put an arm on our shoulders. We are new to this place. Their customs are different from ours, and it's going to take some time to catch up on things. I think Captain Sanchez knows the people and the islands much better than we do. We should follow his advice. I'd hate to start out the first day in our new home by offending someone. But, Mama ignored my stammering. She took Captain Sanchez's hand and shook it. Thank you for explaining the custom to us. Are there other things we should know? Other customs or traditions we might not be familiar with? They talked. I just stood there with my mouth open. What was I going to do with a horse? I liked horses. I loved riding. But what was I going to do with this horse? Why didn't I keep my big mouth shut? A man named Paul Jacobs came about 20 minutes later in a fancy new car. 3 men and a beat-up-looking farm truck followed him. Mr. Jacobs introduced himself to Mama and Daddy as the foreman of the Lanai pineapple plantation. He smiled and shook our hands like he was pumping water from a well. I never seen anybody act so happy to meet someone he didn't even know. The men in the truck loaded our stuff, and Captain Sanchez went with them instead of staying around to visit. Mr. Jacobs seemed right tickled when Mama and Daddy told him about the horse. Fact was, he seemed downright thrilled. He told one of the men to drive the truck and instructed another to take my horse and put it in George Monroe's horse lot. You can keep the horse at Monroe's place, but far as I'm concerned, the old man's loony as a bedbug, he cautioned Daddy. Be wise to keep your wife and boys as far away from him as possible. We climbed in his shiny automobile. What kind of car is this? Daddy asked. She's a 1924 Chrysler, Mr. Jacobs boasted. Maxwell Motor Corporation just came out with them last year. Jim Dole has 2, and there are only 4 others in the whole entire Hawaii territory. As we puttered and chugged up the steep hill that led from the bay, we waved goodbye to Captain Sanchez. From the front of his schooner, he waved and called, Aloha! I liked Captain Sanchez. Mr. Jacobs wanted to know everything there was to know about Daddy and his inventions. He asked Mama what the weather was like in Oklahoma and what the land looked like. He even asked me about my school and if I liked to play baseball. His boy Ted was in 8th grade, and he was sure that we would be best friends. When we were about halfway up the hill, I noticed someone walking ahead of us on the road. We sped closer, and I could see the girl with the long black hair. I wanted to ask if we could give her a ride, but before I could even get a word in, we whooshed past her. A cloud of red dust swirled. I guess it was so thick she didn't even see me wave. I twisted around in the seat and got up on my knees. I went around one curve, then another as we wound our way up the hill. I felt sorry for the girl. Not only did she have to walk to school instead of riding her horse, but now her white blouse was all covered with red dust. We were quite a ways off when the old farm truck with our luggage finally came into view. When I saw the men stop and watched the girl climb onto the back of the truck, I smiled. But when I turned around and sat back down in the seat, I could see Mr. Jacobs' face in the mirror. He was watching too, only he wasn't smiling. That is the end of chapter 4.